of aristocratic parents. After a brief career in the Navy and a failed farming venture in the USA, he arrived in Paris a bankrupt, surviving only by singing in bars. After 10 years, he returned to the family fold, and in 1907, he set up Sweden's first automobile factory. But his growing fascination with flight led him back to Paris, and in 1910, he became the first Swede to hold a pilot's license. Later the same year, he returned to Stockholm and built his first aircraft. It was to launch the Swedish nation into the age of flight. After making some modifications in his car factory, the Baron took off on his first long-distance flight from Copenhagen to Malmö. The extent of the Baron's risk on this long flight can be judged by a newspaper report of the time. We were surprised to learn that Baron Cederström's flying experience consists of only a few hours' instruction at the Blériot School. The fields around Paris are very different to our situation here. No one can quite believe that this flimsy machine will ever get into the air, let alone stay there. All our hearts and prayers go with him, but many doubt if he'll ever be seen again. At Malmö, the Baron's destination, a large crowd gathered. After several hours, the Baron's aircraft appeared through the mist. Following several abortive attempts, the Baron made a bumpy but safe landing. But this wasn't the end of his achievement. During his flight, he had reached a height of 740 meters, a new world altitude record. Despite suffering from frostbite and exposure, the Baron was only too pleased to recount his story to the curious onlookers. As well as his wife and family, who had been too nervous to watch his landing, Baron Cederström was greeted by many of the Swedish aristocracy, including King Gustav, who was captivated by the Baron's first flight and gave him every encouragement. Cederström was soon joined by other aviation pioneers. Born in Denmark, Carl Svensson had been building model gliders since he was a boy. In 1910, he designed and built his first powered box kite aircraft. After a tour of Norway, he arrived in Stockholm, where he met Baron Cederström. Early in 1911, he and the Baron, who had become firm friends, took off. Circling Stockholm, they became the first pilots to fly together in Swedish skies. But the price for the pioneers was heavy. By 1918, Svensson had been badly injured, and the Baron killed while opening up a new route from Stockholm to Finland. From the beginning, the Swedish military have always played a major role in the development of aviation. In 1911, the Royal Swedish Navy received its first machine, a license-built Blériot 12. Piloted by Navy Lieutenant Olof Dahlbeck, who had gained his pilot's license in England, the Blériot 12, or Big Bat as it was known, served for 5 years, writing the first chapter in the Air Force's long history. In the early pioneering days, most of the aircraft flown in Sweden were imported. One man was to change all that and launch Sweden into the field of aircraft production, Enoch Thulin. Born in 1881, Thulin had always been captivated by the ideal of flight. After graduating from university, he spent 3 years studying aeronautics in France. Returning to Stockholm in 1913, he determined to be the first man to fly across the Baltic. Taking off from Landskrona in southern Sweden, in a specially converted floatplane, Thulin flew due south, aiming to reach the German coast at Stralsund near Rostock. But shortly after leaving the Swedish coast, he flew into low cloud. With only a compass which was distorted by the vibration of the engine, Thulin pressed on. A large group of Thulin's family and friends who had traveled ahead to Stralsund waited in the failing light. As the hours passed, the tension mounted. After 3 hours, and much to the relief of his family, Thulin's aircraft broke through the low cloud and made a successful landing. Further flights followed, including a world endurance record of 4 hours, 17 minutes. In September 1913, Tulin founded his own aircraft factory at Landskrona. Initially, the production was only small scale. Specialists from France were brought in to train the Swedish craftsmen in aircraft building techniques. Every process, from building fabric wings to carved wooden propellers, was carried out by hand. Despite its small scale, the Tulin work soon gained a reputation for excellence. The propellers were especially sought after, being some of the finest balanced in Europe. But Tulin's small enterprise was soon to change radically. In 1915, at the height of the First War, the government ordered the establishment of Army and Navy Air Arms. A large order was placed with the Tulin Company. Production was rapidly expanded and modernized. By 1916, more than 1,000 people were employed at the factory. As well as license-built aircraft, many of Tulin's own designs and adaptations were constructed. To test these new designs, he constructed a wind tunnel, one of the first in the world. Not content with aircraft production, Tulin soon started Sweden's first civil pilot school at Ljungbyhed, later to become the Swedish Air Force's main training base. But Tulin's career was to be tragically short. In 1919, 1 month after his marriage, he took off to test one of his new designs. He was never seen again. After his death, the Tulin Company collapsed, due at least in part to the government's decision to import war surplus aircraft from abroad. One of the first was the FVM Phoenix. Originally built in Germany, it served as a basic trainer. Purchased from Britain, the Bristol fighter served alongside the Avro 504 as Sweden's main fighter force of the 1920s. Designed by Claude Dornier, the Friedrichshafen became Sweden's main maritime patrol aircraft. One of the best of the small number of Swedish-designed aircraft was the Tummeliten. Constructed by Porat and Kjellson from drawings left by Enoch Tulin, the Tummeliten served from 1919 to 1935 as an advanced trainer. In 1921, a new force entered Swedish aviation. Ernst Heinkel had moved to Sweden in 1920 to avoid the Versailles Treaty banning aircraft production in Germany. Heinkel soon set up his own company, Svenska Aero AB. Using mostly German engineers, the company soon found a market building float planes for the Swedish Navy. But the enterprise was shrouded in secrecy. The company was never registered, and no financial records were ever kept. In 1932, the firm went bankrupt, and Heinkel returned home to work in the flourishing German aircraft industry. Despite the suspect nature of his company, Heinkel's aircraft proved to be highly successful. The S-5 flew with the Swedish Air Force for 20 years, from 1928. Amongst its many credits is the daring rescue of the Italian explorer Umberto Nobile from his wrecked airship, and the first kill of the Second War, when, ironically, an S-5 shot down a Heinkel 111. A degree of antagonism and a lack of cooperation had always existed between the Army and Navy air arms. The government recognized the importance of a unified and effective fighting force, and in 1926, the two arms were combined to form the Royal Swedish Air Force. Commanded by General Amundsen, the early Air Force's reviews were not very impressive. A variety of imported and home-built aircraft, some already outdated, and different approaches to training, all led to an inefficient and dangerously weak force. To remedy this, Amundsen instituted a series of grueling training exercises. Even in the extremest of weather conditions, the work to bring men and machine up to standard continued. As well as training, Amundsen began annual inter-squadron competitions. This film, shot in 1927, records one of the first ever held. The SK-1s, or albatrosses, are taking part in an extended relay race held between the frozen lakes of northern Sweden. Because of the ground conditions, both men and machine traveled on skis. As well as keeping up morale, the games also provided much-needed experience in air-to-ground cooperation, vital in any future conflict. Air defense exercises were also a high priority. This rare footage records one of the first ever to take place between the Army and Air Force. Phoenix aircraft are being used in a simulated attack on the naval base at Stockholm. The methods may look primitive, but the Swedish Air Force had taken a giant step forward in realizing the awesome destructive power of air attacks on undefended cities. By the beginning of the 1930s, the Royal Swedish Air Force had transformed itself from a collection of badly organized wings into one unified body. Service teams were required to strip down, repair, refuel, and rearm aircraft without the aid of workshops or specialized tools. The Air Force prided itself on the fastest turnaround of aircraft in the world, a record which it retains to this day. However, the standard of training was not matched by the quality of aircraft. To remedy their shortfall in training machines, the Air Force imported various types from abroad. The British Tiger Moth became one of the best loved and most durable basic trainers. The Raab Katzenstein 26 was not so successful. Built under license from Germany, it was difficult to fly and cost a number of lives in its 8 years of service. Despite these failures, the small Swedish aviation industry struggled on. Although the Air Force continued to buy foreign aircraft, like this Dutch Fokker CVE, the small company ASJA fought back, and in 1930 it produced the J6. The J6 proved to be a great success and served as Sweden's frontline fighter defense of the 30s. But events in Europe were about to transform the Swedish Air Force. The rise of Hitler and German rearmament threatened the Swedes' neutral stance. Sweden's geographic position was extremely vulnerable. Germany already controlled the Baltic, Sweden's main trade route, and Russia threatened invasion through Finland. In the autumn of 1936, the government went into a crisis meeting, at the end of which the Prime Minister, Albin Hansson, stated, "As far as possible, our nation should produce its own weapons. Every instance in which we buy from abroad makes us more dependent on other countries." General Olsen explains,
"If you can't defend your air territory, you are very bad off whatever you do with the rest of your defense, because then it will be a question more on when you came down on your knees instead of if you came down on your knees. So I think the Air Force will take a very active part in neutrality defense. And I think this has been aware to our politicians for a very long time. And I think then when they took the decision in 1936 of strengthening the Air Force, I think it was just a very strong awareness from the political side of the importance of the Air Force in a defense aiming for neutrality.
The result of the Swedish government's decision was twofold. Firstly, to institute a large-scale Swedish aircraft industry, and secondly, to double the size of the Air Force. But both policies would take time, and to fill the gap, the Air Force was compelled to import combat machines. The B-4, a license-built version of the Hawker Hart, formed the major part of Sweden's bomber force from 1937 to 1942. Although obsolete even when the first Swedish-built B-4 rolled off the production line, it continued to serve throughout the Second War. Easy to fly and very reliable, Swedish pilots became masters of pinpoint bombing. By 1937, Sweden's aircraft production was rapidly expanding. ASJA was soon joined by a new company, backed by the government and Bofors. It was to be known as Svenska Aeroplan AB, or Saab. Both companies began new plants at Trollhättan and Linköping. From the beginning, the government recognized the need for a joint cooperative effort, and a separate body was established to oversee production. Sweden's aircraft industry often hung on the diplomacy of men like Gunnar Delmer, Saab's first president. By the late 30s, the Air Force had recognized its critical need for a heavy bomber, and as a result, Saab's first product was to be the German-designed Junkers Ju-86. A license had been purchased in 1937, and German technicians supervised all the early stages of production of this twin-engine bomber. However, by 1938, the production was solely in Swedish hands. Although not obsolete in 1937, It was the result of proven but outdated technology, and the Luftwaffe phased them out in 1939, the same year as the first Swedish-built Ju-86 took to the air. As the new aircraft began to roll off the production line, a new generation of men had to be trained to fly and service them. Ever since its inception, the Swedish Air Force's greatest enemy had been the weather. Temperatures in the north often reached minus 40 degrees Celsius, well below the freezing point of petrol and oil. Engines had oil stoves and insulated jackets. After each flight, the oil was drained and kept heated overnight. In conditions that would have grounded most other air forces, the Swedes remained operational. In 1938, the Air Force had re-equipped its training squadrons with the US-built NA-16. Fitted with skis to allow it to operate from frozen runways and lakes, the NA-16 became a firm favorite with cadets, not least because of its heated cabin. On September the 1st, 1939, Germany invaded Poland, and Europe was plunged into war. In the following months, belligerent and neutral countries alike were attacked and occupied. The Swedish Air Force demanded more aircraft, but competition between the two companies had led to mismanagement and delays. In 1939, with invasion imminent, the government took a momentous step and merged the two companies. The resulting organization was known simply as Saab. But the crisis in Sweden was only just beginning.
We were limited in our possibility to import aircraft from abroad. We were stopped by the Americans, by the Republic fighter aircraft, for example. And then we were quite aware of the importance of an own individual aircraft industry.
With overseas supplies restricted, Saab threw all its efforts into a project that dated back to the mid-1930s. Developed in collaboration with a group of US engineers and designers, the Saab 17 was to be a high-performance mid-wing monoplane. At the beginning of 1940, the US workers were withdrawn, and Saab's design team were left to complete the project. The first prototype was constructed in the spring in record time. Every effort had been made to create a design that would be easy to mass produce, so that deployment could take place as soon as possible. On the 18th of May 1940, the S-17 was wheeled out for its first test flight. After initial teething troubles produced by the speed of the design program, the S-17 proved to be a great success, and mass production was ordered to start at once. Built in both reconnaissance and bomber versions, the S-17 was equipped with a unique retractable undercarriage that could, in the space of a few minutes, be converted from wheels to skis, enabling deployment no matter what the ground conditions. The brief lull after the fall of France came to a sudden end in April 1940, when Germany invaded Norway. Despite spirited resistance, the outdated Norwegian Air Force was shot out of the skies, and Norway fell in a matter of weeks. Although re-equipping as fast as possible, the Swedish Air Force was extremely vulnerable. During the invasion of Norway, it could put only one fighter squadron into the air. Flying outdated Gloucester Gladiators, it was hardly a match for the Me-109s of the Luftwaffe. But the Swedes used their limited resources to maximum effect, dispersing their aircraft in woods and fields to avoid ground attack, and using the Gladiators' high rate of climb from makeshift airstrips to surprise intruders. As the war progressed, the Air Force became better prepared. A large fighter base was built at Gothenburg on the west coast. Extensive underground facilities were constructed, and for the first time, intercept missions were coordinated from a central point. Safe from attack in underground hangars, aircraft could be serviced and rearmed. These J-11 fighters are actually imported Fiat CR-42s, which served in frontline service throughout the war. Of all the stopgap aircraft purchased by the government, the American-built Republic E-1 was the most modern. It was intended to form the backbone of the Swedish fighter force, but although 300 were ordered, only 60 were delivered. The rest were confiscated for the US war effort. With a long and vulnerable coastline to defend, a strong maritime force was essential. The Heinkel E-115A served in the Naval Reconnaissance and Escort role for 10 years, from 1939. It represented the last of a long line of Heinkel floatplanes that had done faithful service since the early 1920s. As Sweden's Air Force grew in strength, a series of large exercises were ordered. These mock battles served two vital purposes. They gave air crew vital battle experience, essential for an air force that had never been to war. And they also served as a deterrent, showing outside aggressors that any invasion would be extremely costly. The policy of mass dispersal was now firmly in place. Bomber squadrons could be completely hidden in the dense forests, taking off from fields or open ground that needed little or no preparation, making it almost impossible for an enemy to destroy them on the ground. The heavy B-3, however, needed more permanent facilities, and to avoid the possibility of being surprised on the ground, air crew had to be able to scramble in under 2 minutes. In the event of real invasion, the bomber force would mass from many different points and attempt to deal a knockout blow to any seaborne or land attack. The effectiveness of the Swedish response to any attack can never be known. But by the second year of the war, the quality of its air force and aircraft industry made the defense of neutrality seem to be an achievable goal. With the prospect of attack from both Germany and Russia, Sweden's fighter force was kept on constant alert. Although a neutral power, Sweden had the right to intercept and attack any aircraft violating its airspace. From 1940 to 1945, 126 German aircraft were intercepted and either forced down or destroyed. Despite intensive diplomatic pressure, Sweden never allowed German aircraft to overfly the country. Any incursion was treated as a hostile act. However, not all damaged aircraft were pursued to destruction, as a recoverable machine provided invaluable information on the state of German aviation technology. Towards the end of the war, many German pilots, defecting from the Russian front, landed in Sweden. Many of these aircraft, like the Focke-Wulf Condor and the Ju-52, were converted and put to civilian use after the war. So many Friesler Storches landed in Sweden during the war that the Air Force was able to equip a whole training squadron in 1946. For Allied aircraft damaged in bombing raids over Germany, Sweden was the nearest safe haven. During the war, 141 US and 63 British planes landed safely in Sweden. On arrival, the planes were impounded and either stripped down or converted to military and civilian use. In 1943, the first Swedish-designed high-performance fighter was introduced. Strongly influenced by the best of German and Allied technology,